$50. That was all it took for Corinne Hadley to become the owner of a condemned farm shed no contractor wanted. The roof's rust had eaten through the siding. One contractor laughed and told her, "Lady, you are buying yourself a demolition bill." What he did not know was that Corinne had already stepped inside. Beneath that ruined metal skin stood a hand-hewn white oak frame, locked together with mortise and tenon joints and wooden pegs, the kind of timber work worth thousands. Her father had taught her how to read a building like that when she was young. Everyone else saw scrap. Corinne saw a house, then the gavel fell. She had slept in a minivan behind a Baptist church the night before, with only $319 to her name, and Boone waiting for her. Now she had just $269 left, no land of her own, no truck, no trailer, no crew, and only 30 days to remove a building weighing several thousand pounds. The men had laughed because they thought she had bought a wreck. They were wrong. But knowing what was hidden inside the shed was the easy part. How do you move several thousand pounds of timber with $269? And where do you put it when you do not own a single foot of land? $50. That was the final price on a 16 by 24-foot farm shed at an estate auction in Howell County, Missouri, after every contractor in the field refused to bid on it. The woman who raised her hand had slept in a minivan behind a Baptist church the night before with $319 to her name, and a cattle dog named Boone waiting on the passenger seat. But hidden under that shed's rusted siding was a white oak timber frame worth thousands, and 16 months later it would hold a wood stove, solar lights, and a cast iron clawfoot tub full of hot water heated by nothing but sunlight and firewood. To understand why a 49-year-old single mother was bidding on a condemned building with money she could not afford to lose, you have to go back 8 months to a wet tile floor in a hospital basement in West Plains, Missouri. Corinne Hadley had cleaned floors and pushed laundry carts at the county hospital for 22 years. She knew every drain grate on the basement level by the sound it made when the mop handle crossed it. She knew which elevator stuck between the second and third floors on humid mornings and which supply closet lock you had to lift and turn at the same time, or it would jam until maintenance came on Monday. She knew that the fluorescent tube above the loading dock entrance flickered twice before it went out entirely, and she had reported it 4 times, and nobody had replaced it. And she had learned to prop the door with her hip and navigate the first 6 feet in the dark by counting floor tiles with her shoe. 22 years. She started at 27, the year after her daughter Jessamine was born. And she worked every shift they gave her because the hospital had insurance. And the insurance covered Jess's ear infections and the antibiotics and the one emergency room visit. When Jess swallowed a penny at 3 years old and Corinne drove 19 miles in a rainstorm because the ambulance would have cost $400. Her husband walked out 14 years into the marriage. He did not leave a note. He left a 6-week-old cattle dog on the kitchen floor because the dog was not housebroken yet, and he did not want it in his new apartment. The dog's name was Boone, and he had cost $20 from a farmer outside Mountain View, and he was the last purchase Corinne's husband ever made for that household. Their daughter Jess was 14 when she chose to go with her father. She did not explain why. She packed a bag and got in his truck, and the last thing she said to Corinne was that she would call when she got settled. She called twice that first month. Then, once. Then not at all for 3 months. Then once more on Corinne's birthday, a conversation that lasted 4 minutes and covered nothing except the weather in Tulsa and the fact that Jess was doing fine. The divorce settlement gave Corinne nothing because there was nothing to give. No house, no savings, no retirement account, just a rental and a dog and a job that paid enough to keep both. She kept showing up. She kept the mop moving. She kept the rent check on the landlord's counter on the first of every month for 11 years straight. Because that was the one number in her life she could control. In March of 2021, the basement floor was wet. It was always wet on Mondays because the weekend crew never ran the squeegee after mopping, and the tile held water in the low spots near the laundry room door. Corinne had reported it. She had written it on the maintenance request form 3 separate times. The form went into a box on the supervisor's desk, and the box went to someone in facilities management, and the someone in facilities management had other things to worry about in a county hospital running on a budget that had been cut twice in 4 years. She was pushing a loaded laundry cart through the basement corridor when the front wheels caught on wet tile and the cart jerked sideways. She held on because letting go would have sent 200 pounds of soiled linens across the floor, and the instinct of 22 years told her to hold on and redirect. The cart swung. Her left arm took the full torque of the load, and something inside her shoulder tore with a pain that hit like a cable snapping, a white-hot line from her shoulder blade to her collarbone that dropped her to one knee next to the cart with her hand pressed flat against the cold floor, breathing through her teeth until a nurse's aide found her 11 minutes later. The surgery went fine. The surgeon was a young man who spoke to her the way young doctors speak to older patients, slowly, and with a kindness that assumes you might not understand the words he is using. He told her 6 weeks of physical therapy and she would have 80% range of motion back. He told her the repair was clean and the prognosis was good. He did not tell her what would happen to her job or her insurance or her ability to pay the surgical bill he was generating while he spoke. That was not his department. Everything after the surgery did not go fine. She spent 5 months out of work. The first month was surgery and recovery and the particular loneliness of lying in a rented bed in a small house with a dog and no one to call. The second month was physical therapy 3 times a week at a clinic in West Plains, where a therapist named Donna moved her arm through ranges of motion that made her grip the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. The third month, Corinne started feeling almost normal. The fourth month, the hospital eliminated her position. Workers' compensation covered part of the surgical bill. The part it did not cover totaled a little over $31,000, and those numbers arrived in her mailbox, in envelopes she stopped opening after the third one because she already knew what the math looked like. Every envelope carried the logo of a different medical billing company because the hospital had outsourced its collections the way hospitals do, splitting one debt into 6 different accounts, handled by 6 different offices in 6 different states, each one sending its own letters on its own schedule, as if coordinating would have been too much trouble. Then, in month 4, the letter came. Not from a billing company, from the hospital itself. A contractor restructuring. Her position had been eliminated. The Environmental Services Department was being outsourced to a private company based in Kansas City, and all existing staff positions were terminated effective immediately. 22 years ended in a single paragraph on hospital letterhead. The letter thanked her for her service. It did not mention the wet tile floor or the laundry cart, or the fact that the drain grate outside the supply room had been reported twice for missing bolts. It did not mention that she had trained every new hire on the basement level for the last 12 years, or that she had never called in sick on a holiday, or that she had once found a patient's wedding ring behind a baseboard in room 214 and turned it in to the nursing station, instead of putting it in her pocket the way anyone else might have done. It thanked her, and it wished her well. And that was the end of Corinne Hadley's career at the county hospital. The next envelope came from her landlord. Except it was not her landlord anymore. Gerald Moody, the man who had rented her the small 2-bedroom house on Elm for 11 years, had sold the property to an investment group out of Springfield. The new owner raised her rent from $650 to $1,100 in one letter, one page, one paragraph. No phone call, no conversation, no mention of 11 years of on-time payments. Corinne stood in her kitchen and read that letter twice. Not because she misunderstood it, but because she wanted to make sure she was not inventing a reason to feel as broken as she felt. The math was already finished. She could see it clearly. $31,000 in medical debt, 0 income, and a rent increase that assumed she had a life she no longer possessed. She picked up her phone that evening and called her daughter. Jessamine lived in Tulsa. Everyone called her Jess. She was 24 years old, and Corinne had not heard her voice in almost 5 months. The phone rang 4 times, and when Jess answered, there was noise behind her, A restaurant maybe, or a television. Something that told Corinne her daughter was in the middle of a life that did not include waiting for this call. Corinne told her what had happened: the injury, the surgery, the job, the bulls, the rent. She kept her voice steady the way she always did when she talked to Jess, because she had learned a long time ago that showing too much need pushed her daughter further away rather than closer. Jess listened. Then she said she was sorry. She said it sounded really hard. And then she said maybe Corinne should contact a shelter because there were programs for situations like this, and Jess just was not in a position to help right now. Corinne held the phone against her ear for a few seconds after Jess stopped talking. She did not argue. She did not ask again. She said okay, and she said goodnight, and she set the phone on the kitchen counter face down. Boone was lying on the linoleum next to the stove, watching her with his chin on his paws. She looked at him and understood something she had been refusing to understand for 6 years. Her daughter had not chosen a side in the divorce. Her daughter had chosen an absence. Corinne was not hated. She was simply not worth the inconvenience. The homeless shelter in West Plains had a waiting list. Corinne called on a Wednesday morning, and a woman with a tired voice told her the wait was approximately 3 weeks, and she would need to provide identification and proof of income or lack thereof. Then the woman asked if she had any pets. Corinne said she had a dog. The woman said the shelter had a strict no animal policy, and Corinne would need to find alternative placement for the animal before intake. Boone had been with Corinne since the week her husband left. He had slept on the floor next to her bed for 9 years. He had walked beside her to the mailbox every afternoon and waited outside the bathroom door every morning and put his chin on her knee every evening when she sat in the kitchen chair and read the newspaper. He was the one living thing in that house that had never asked her to be smaller or quieter or less of a problem. He did not care about the medical bills or the lost job or the empty bank account. He cared about whether she was there when he woke up in the morning, and she had never once failed him on that count. Handing him over to a shelter or a stranger was never going to happen. Not while she was breathing. That was the one decision in this entire collapse that required no calculation at all. So she sold what she could at a yard sale on the last Saturday before her final rent was due. The kitchen table brought $12. The couch brought $15. A box of her daughter's old books that Jess had never come back for brought $8. A woman bought Corinne's winter coat for $3 and tried to negotiate down to $2. Corinne let her have it for $2 because arguing over $1 felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. By the end of the afternoon, she had $319 in small bills in an envelope in her jacket pocket. And everything she owned fit in the back of a 2004 Pontiac minivan with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat Boone had worn smooth with 9 years of sitting. She drove to the parking lot behind the Baptist church on the south end of town. Pastor Devlin Foss had told her quietly, without putting it on any official record, that nobody would bother her there. He said it the way people say things when they know the help they are offering is not enough, but they cannot stand to offer nothing. He also told her the church restroom was unlocked between 6 in the morning and 9 at night, and that if she needed anything to come to the office door, not the front entrance, because the front entrance was visible from the road, and Corinne did not need the town knowing her business. Corinne parked under a hackberry tree and cut the engine. Boone turned a circle on the passenger seat and lay down with his nose against the window. The church parking lot was empty. The sun was going down behind the tree line, and the light came through the windshield in long orange bars that moved slowly across the dashboard and disappeared. This was her home now, a minivan behind a church with a dog who trusted her, and $319 that had to last until something changed or until it ran out, whichever came first. The first night she did not sleep. She lay across the back seat with a blanket from the yard sale, and Boone pressed against her legs and listened to every sound the parking lot made. A truck on the highway, a possum in the dumpster, the wind moving through the hackberry leaves like a hand shuffling papers. She had slept in this van once before, years ago, when an ice storm knocked out power to her rental, and the house dropped below 40 degrees by midnight. That night, she had known it was temporary. This night, she did not know anything except that she was 49 years old, and the distance between her life and the ground had finally reached zero. She developed a routine, because routine was the only thing standing between her and the kind of despair that makes people stop trying. She woke before dawn. She drove Boone to a park at the edge of town where he could run along the creek for 20 minutes. She washed her face in the restroom at the gas station on Route 63, where the clerk knew her from buying coffee and never said a word about the minivan or the sleeping bag visible through the back window. She changed clothes in the van. She brushed her teeth. She made herself presentable in the way that matters when you are applying for jobs. And the person across the counter is deciding in the first 3 seconds whether you look like someone they want to hire or someone they want to pity. Every morning, she drove to the public library in West Plains and sat at the free computers filling out job applications. The library opened at 9, and Corinne was waiting at the door at 8:55 every weekday morning, with Boone tied to the bike rack outside where the librarian had placed a bowl of water without being asked. She applied for cleaning work, stock work, cashier work, anything that did not require her to lift more than her shoulder could handle, which was not much. She applied to gas stations and dollar stores and the school district and a veterinary office that wanted someone to mop kennels. She applied to a laundromat and a car wash and a church daycare center and a farm supply warehouse that wanted a night security guard. Most of the applications disappeared into silence. The ones that responded said they would keep her information on file, which is the professional way of saying no without having to watch someone's face when they hear it. 2 interviews ended the same way. The hiring manager would look at her application, see the gap in employment, ask about it, hear the words rotator cuff and workers' compensation, and the conversation would change direction the way a river changes direction when it hits a rock. Nobody said it was because of the injury. Nobody had to. And it was there, at one of those library computers, on a Tuesday afternoon, that Corinne found the notice. Someone had left a copy of the Howell County Weekly on the table next to the printer. She picked it up because she had 20 minutes before her computer session expired, and the newspaper was free. And free was a word that governed most of her decisions now. She turned past the church announcements and the 4-H results and the sheriff's blotter and found the legal notices near the back. Hutton Farm Estate Auction, machinery, tools, household goods, and one line near the bottom of the listing that almost everyone skips. Outbuildings sold as removable lots. Buyer must clear the site within 30 days. Most people read that line and see a demolition job. A money pit. 30 days to tear something down and haul it away at your own expense. And whatever you are hauling is probably rotted through anyway. Corinne read that line and saw her childhood. She grew up on a small cattle farm near Mountain View, Missouri, 60 miles south of West Plains. Her father built and repaired barns with hand tools. He could look at a ridgepole and tell you whether the man who set it knew what he was doing or was guessing. He taught Corinne things no school ever put on a test. How to read the grain direction in a board before you cut it. How a mortise and tenon joint locks tighter under load instead of loosening. How the old builders in the Ozarks used white oak for framing, because white oak does not rot the way red oak does, and how they join those frames with wooden pegs instead of because a peg swells when it gets wet and grips harder while a nail just rusts. Her father had been dead for 11 years, but the things he taught her were still in her hands. And when she read that line in the county newspaper about outbuildings sold as removable lots, she did not see a demolition bill. She saw the skeleton of something that might still be standing inside whatever rust and rot had accumulated on the surface. She saw the possibility that a builder from the 1950s had done exactly what her father would have done. And if he had, then what was underneath that failing exterior was worth more than anyone at that auction would know. She tore the notice out of the newspaper and put it in her jacket pocket. That night in the minivan, she lay awake with Boone breathing next to her and did math on the back of a gas station receipt. $319. Even if she won the bid, she would need a way to move entire building frame. She would need land to put it on. She would need tools she did not own and materials she could not buy. Every number she wrote down argued against going to that auction. The receipt filled up with subtraction, and she turned it over and kept writing on the other side. The numbers did not work. They did not come close to working. There was no version of this calculation that ended with a positive balance and a standing building. She went anyway. She went because the numbers had stopped working a long time ago, and she was still alive. And because the one thing she had learned from her father that no math could contradict was that knowing what is inside a structure before anyone else sees it is not luck. It is knowledge, and knowledge is the only advantage that does not require money. Auction day was a Saturday in early October. The morning was cold enough to see breath, but warm enough that the frost had burned off the grass by 9. The Hutton farm sat on a county road north of West Plains, with a rusted gate and a gravel drive lined with hackberry trees that had not been trimmed in years. Harold Hutton had died at 87 the previous spring, and his children lived in other states, and had no interest in running a cattle operation on 160 acres of Ozark hill country. They wanted it liquidated. They wanted checks. The auctioneer had been hired out of Springfield, and he set up his podium on the back of a flatbed truck and started the morning with the big-ticket items, because that is where the money is, and auctioneers work on commission. There were maybe 40 people in the field, most of them men in work boots and seed caps, a few dealers from Springfield eyeing the John Deere equipment, and a handful of neighbors who had come to watch the last of the Hutton place get divided up and carried off. Corinne recognized the rhythm of it. She had been to auctions like this as a child when her father would drive to a neighbor's farm sale and stand at the back of the crowd with his hands in his pockets, watching the equipment go and waiting for the lots. Nobody wanted because the lots nobody wanted were where the value was if you knew what to look for. Corinne walked straight past the tractors and the hay rakes and the dealers writing numbers on their bidding cards. She walked past the household goods laid out on folding tables, the cast iron skillets and the mason jars, and the quilting frame that drew a small crowd of women. She walked to the back of the property, where a 16 by 24-foot shed stood alone at the edge of an overgrown fence line. The siding was corrugated steel, rusted through in patches. One corner of the roof had a visible sag. The sliding door hung crooked on its track. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was listed as: a teardown, a liability, a 30-day headache nobody wanted. Corinne stepped inside. The light came through the rust holes in the siding in thin, bright lines that crossed the dirt floor like scattered wire. The air smelled like old iron and dry wood, and the particular dusty sweetness of a building that has been closed for a long time. She's looked up at the frame, and there it was. Thick, cut, white oak, joined with mortise and tenon joints, and secured with wooden pegs, exactly the way her father would have built it. The beams were hand-hewn. She could see the adze marks on the flats, the slight scallop pattern that a machine planer never leaves. The mark of a man who shaped each timber by hand. Because that was how it was done in the 1950s in rural Missouri, when the nearest lumber yard was 40 miles away. And you built with what you had, and you built it to last, because you could not afford to build it twice. The joints were tight. She checked 3 of them by pressing the heel of her hand against the shoulder of the tenon and feeling for movement. There was none. 70 years of weather had eaten the skin of this building alive. The siding was garbage. The roof was a liability. The sliding door was scrap, but the skeleton underneath was sound. It was more than sound. It was the kind of frame that people pay restoration architects $15,000 to design on paper, and here it was standing in a field behind an estate auction, being sold as a demolition lot. Milled new today, white oak timber like that costs more than some used cars. A single hewn beam of that size would run $300 to $400 from a specialty sawmill, and there were 16 major timbers in this frame, plus rafters, plus collar ties, plus bracing. The contractor standing out in the field did not walk in here. They saw corrugated rust and a sagging roof and a 30-day removal clause, and they did the same math everyone does. Losing proposition. Not worth the diesel. Corinne stood alone in that shed, and ran her hand along a beam and felt the grain under her palm and understood something that no one else in that field understood. She was not looking at a demolition project. She was looking at a house. The auctioneer opened at $100 and got silence. The crowd had thinned by then, and the people still standing near the shed were there mostly out of curiosity, or because they had not found their truck keys yet. He dropped to $50. One hand went up in the entire field, and it was hers. A contractor standing 3 rows back said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Lady, you are buying yourself a demolition bill." A couple of men laughed. The auctioneer looked at Corinne with something between pity and professional obligation, asked if there were any other bids, heard nothing, and brought the gavel down. Corinne signed the paperwork at a folding table next to the auctioneer's truck. Her hand shook slightly, but her face showed nothing. $50. She now owned a building and not 1 square foot of ground to put it on. The 30-day clock was already running. She had $269 left, a minivan, a cattle dog, and a condemned shed full of white oak treasure that nobody else could see. She drove out of that field and pulled over on the county road half a mile from the farm gate. Boone put his chin on her thigh, and she sat there with the engine idling and her hands on the wheel and the paperwork on the seat beside her. $269. A building that weighed several thousand pounds. No land, no truck, no trailer, no crew, and 29 days before the estate executor had every right to charge her for the demolition she was supposed to have completed. She had just made either the most important decision of her life or the most reckless one, and at that moment the two looked exactly the same. But the paperwork was signed. The receipt was in her pocket, and somewhere inside the panic and the impossible math, there was a feeling she had not felt since the morning she reported for her first shift at the hospital 22 years ago. It was the feeling of having committed to something that could not be undone. It was the feeling of forward motion after 8 months of falling. And this is the point where most people would have stopped, called it a mistake. Let the 30 days expire and written off the $50 as a lesson in desperation. Most people do not have Corinne's hands. And most people did not grow up watching a man build barns from scratch in the Ozark Hills. And understanding that the difference between impossible and possible is almost always one phone call to the right person. Corinne went back to the one person who had already helped her once. Pastor Devlin Foss did not have land. He did not have money. He was a 63-year-old Baptist minister who drove a pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it and who had been serving the same congregation for 28 years on a salary that a school teacher would have found modest. What he had was a telephone and 40 years of relationships with every church congregation in 3 counties. And in rural Missouri, those relationships are worth more than money because money runs out and a good reputation compounds. He made calls that week from his office at the Baptist church, sitting at a desk cluttered with sermon notes and church bulletins and a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Fisherman." He called 5 people. 3 of them said no, for the same reason everyone says no when someone asks if a stranger can build on their land. They said no because the liability was unclear and the arrangement was unusual, and they did not know this woman. 1 did not return the call, and the 5th call went to a widow from a sister congregation up in the hills north of town. Opal Rankin was 81 years old. She had lived on 40 acres of hill country since marrying Wallace Rankin at 19, and she had buried him 2 springs earlier in the plot behind the machine shed where he had asked to be put. Her garden had gone to ragweed. Her fence lines were down in 3 places. The gravel on her road had washed out in 2 spots that made the drive dangerous after rain. And her daughter Nadine called every single week from Tulsa pushing the same argument. Assisted living. A nice facility, professionals who could monitor her medications and make sure she ate properly and keep her safe from the 1,000 things that could go wrong when an 81-year-old woman lived alone on 40 acres with no one watching. Opal's answer never changed, and it was no. She would die on that ridge before she would die in a room that smelled like floor wax and boiled vegetables, surrounded by people who called her by her first name without asking permission. That hill was hers. Wallace was buried on it. The answer was no. Corinne drove up the gravel hill on a Thursday afternoon with the windows down because the minivan's air conditioning had stopped working 2 years ago. And October in the Ozarks is still warm enough to sweat. The road was worse than she expected. Deep ruts from spring runoff that had never been graded. Loose stone in the curves where the gravel had washed to the outside edge. One stretch near the top where the road had eroded to bare clay, and the minivan's tires spun for a moment before catching. Boone sat on the passenger seat with his ears forward, reading the landscape the way cattle dogs do, cataloging every fence post and tree line and open gate, as if compiling a report he intended to file. The house was a white frame farmhouse, with a wraparound porch that needed paint. The porch boards were solid, but the railing had a lean to it and two of the balusters were missing. The kitchen garden on the south side of the house had surrendered to weeds sometime the previous summer, and the ragweed stood waist-high, thick enough to hide the garden fence underneath it. Corinne could see all of this from the driveway, and she could see something else too. She could see that the bones of this property were good. The house was level. The roofline was straight. The machine shed behind the house still had its doors. This was not a place falling apart from neglect. It was a place falling behind because one person could not do the work of two, and the person who was missing had been buried behind the machine shed. She knocked on the front door and Opal opened it and looked at her without saying anything for a long moment. Opal Rankin was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pinned back in a style that had not changed since the 1970s, and hands that showed 70 years of garden work and canning and fence mending. The knuckles were swollen, the skin was thin, but the grip when she held the screen door open was firm and deliberate. Her eyes were sharp and her posture was straight, and nothing about her suggested a woman who needed to be managed by professionals in a facility. She looked like exactly what she was, which was Ozark farm woman who had outlived her husband and most of her patients and was not interested in being managed by anyone. Corinne made her offer standing on the porch. She did not rush it. She laid it out the way her father used to lay out a deal when he was trading with a neighbor. Plain and complete. No hidden terms, no pressure. She would bring the garden back. She would mend the fences, all 3 breaks. She would split and stack a winter's worth of firewood. She would mow the yard and the road shoulders and the area around the machine shed where the grass had grown tall enough to harbor copperheads. And she would drive Opal to her appointments in town because Opal no longer trusted her own eyes on the highway after dark. And the last time she had driven to West Plains at night, she had crossed the center line twice without realizing it. In exchange, Corinne could rebuild her shed on a back ridge near an old spring, out of sight of the road and out of the way of everything. She would need nothing from Opal except the ground and the permission. She would bring her own materials. She would do her own work. She would not ask for money or food or utilities because there were no utilities to ask for on a back ridge in the Ozark Hills. Opal looked at her. Then she looked past her at the minivan where Boone was sitting with his nose pressed against the window, fogging the glass with his breath. Opal looked at that dog for a while. Then she said the garden gate hinge was broken and Corinne could start there. The whole contract was a handshake and a broken hinge. No paper, no lawyer, no terms except the ones 2 women agreed to while standing on a porch in the Ozark Hills with the afternoon light falling through the hackberry leaves and a cattle dog watching from a minivan. But what Corinne did not know and what Opal did not mention, because Opal did not know all of it herself, was that Opal's daughter Nadine had already contacted a real estate broker in Springfield to get a market appraisal on the 40 acres. Nadine Orfila was 56 years old. She had left this hill at 25 and moved to Tulsa, and married a man who sold commercial insurance and built a life that looked from the outside like the kind of life you build when you leave a gravel road in the Ozarks and never come back except for Thanksgiving and the occasional summer visit that gets shorter every year. But the outside of Nadine's life and the inside of it had been diverging for some time. Her husband's business had contracted. The house in Tulsa was mortgaged twice. The credit cards had balances that grew faster than the payments could reduce them. And Nadine had her own reasons for wanting her mother off that land, reasons that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with a financial situation that was getting worse by the month. She had been in contact with a development company out of Springfield that had been buying hill country parcels north of West Plains, and the conversations had reached the stage where dollar figures were being discussed. The assisted living argument was real, but it was the door, not the destination. The destination was 40 acres of Ozark hill country, with a clear title and a motivated seller. And the only thing standing between Nadine and that sale was her mother's refusal to leave. And now there was a second obstacle Nadine did not yet know about. A woman in a minivan with a cattle dog and a handshake agreement, and 29 days left to move a building onto land that Nadine considered her inheritance. Corinne drove back down the gravel hill that afternoon, with a place to put her building and 30 days to get it there. She had no crew, no equipment, and a shoulder that still ached when she raised her arm above her head. The frame she had just bought weighed several thousand pounds. Her vehicle was a minivan. The math of the situation was impossible in every direction she turned it. But impossible math was the only kind Corinne had been doing for the last 8 months. And she was still here. And the math had not killed her yet. And somewhere in Tulsa, a woman she had never met was drawing up plans to sell the ground out from under her before the first peg went home. Now came the part that defeats almost everyone who buys a removal lot. You cannot tow a timber frame building behind a minivan. But a mortise and tenon frame has a secret that factory-built structures do not. It is designed to come apart exactly the way it went together. Every joint is a puzzle piece. Every peg is a key. And if you number them correctly before you start, the whole thing can be disassembled and reassembled like a cathedral made of Lincoln logs, provided you have the patience and the back for it. Corinne spent 2 full days on a ladder with a lump of blue chalk, marking a number on both sides of every joint, every beam, every rafter, and photographing each mark on a $30 flip phone with a cracked screen she had bought at a pawn shop in West Plains. She filled an entire pocket notebook with diagrams showing which beam connected to which post and which rafter sat in which bird's mouth. Her father had taught her this. If you take a frame apart without numbering it, you will spend the rest of your life trying to figure out which timber goes where. If you number it first, the building remembers itself. Then she started knocking out pegs. A wooden mallet and a steel drift pin, borrowed from Opal's machine shed. Wallace Rankin had kept his tools organized on a pegboard above the workbench, and even 2 years after his death, every tool was still in its place, hung on the same hook where he had left it. The mallet was heavy, and the drift pin was slightly bent from years of use, but both did exactly what they needed to do. Each peg came free with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle, a soft pop followed by the creak of oak, releasing oak after 70 years of holding on. Some of them resisted. One peg near the ridge beam had swollen so tightly into its bore that Corinne had to work it back and forth for 20 minutes before it fraction of an inch. And when it finally came free, it looked as fresh and solid as the day it went in. White oak does that. It gets harder with time. It does not forgive, and it does not forget. She lowered the frame one timber at a time, working from the top, down the way her father had taught her. Because working from the bottom up in a timber frame is how you die under a falling building. Rafters first, then collar ties, then the heavy bent frames that form the skeleton of the walls. She lowered each piece onto a pad of old hay. She spread on the ground to cushion the impact because dropping a hand-hewn beam onto hard earth can crack the tenon shoulder, and a cracked tenon is a ruined joint. Some of those beams weighed close to 200 pounds, and there was no machine on that property that could lift them. Corinne moved them the way her father had moved beams. She walked them end over end across the grass, tipping one end forward, stepping around, tipping the other end, covering 6 feet with every rotation. By the end of the first day, her shirt was soaked through, and the muscles in her back were knotted, so tightly she could feel them pulling when she breathed. By the end of the second day, her hands were blistered under the work gloves, and her shoulder was screaming at a volume she had learned to translate into instructions. This angle is acceptable. This angle is not. Stop now, or lose what the surgeon gave you. It is the slowest and most exhausting way to move a heavy timber, and it is also the only way that works when you are one person with no equipment and a shoulder that sends a white flash of pain up your neck every time you push past the angle the surgeon told you not to exceed. The rotted siding stayed in the scrap pile. She stripped it off and left it in a heap at the edge of the Hutton property, because the siding was never the point. The skin of that building was worthless. The bones were everything. By the time she finished stripping, the frame stood naked in the October sunlight, and it was beautiful. Clean lines, honest joinery. The work of a man who built as if someone was going to inspect every joint in 70 years, which is exactly what Corinne had done. Carl Jessup ran the counter at the feed store in West Plains. He was a quiet man in his early 60s who wore the same canvas jacket from September through April, and who had the kind of patience that comes from spending 30 years selling 50-pound bags of cattle feed to people who want to talk about the weather before they get to the point. Corinne had known him slightly from buying dog food and the occasional bag of garden lime. When she asked to borrow a 16-foot cattle trailer for a weekend, Carl looked at her for a moment, then looked at the minivan parked outside, then looked back at her and said he would loan it for the cost of diesel. $40. Two teenage brothers from Opal's church helped load beams for a Saturday. $20 each plus gas station fried chicken. They were strong and willing and completely uninterested in why a woman was hauling old wood up a gravel road in a borrowed cattle trailer. 4 trips up that hill moved an entire building. 4 loads of white oak and history stacked on a ridge next to an old spring where cold water came out of the rock and ran downhill through a stand of walnut trees. The rebuild ate the rest of the fall. October turned to November, and Corinne worked from first light until the sun dropped behind the ridge to the west, which happened earlier every week. She ate lunch sitting on a timber, with Boone beside her and a sandwich from the day-old bread rack at the grocery store in town. She drank water from the spring, and she kept a thermos of coffee on the ground next to whatever joint she was working on, because coffee was one of the 3 expenses she allowed herself without guilt. The other 2 were dog food and gasoline. 70 years of ground contact had rotted the 2 sill beams soft and punky. She could push a screwdriver into them up to the handle. Everything above the sills was solid, but the sills themselves were gone, which meant she needed new ones. She drove to a sawmill outside Willow Springs, a small operation run by a man who cut local timber to order and sold the pieces that did not meet his standards from a pile at the back of the yard. $30 for boards the mill owner called culls, meaning they were too ugly and too knotty to sell to anyone who cared about appearance. Corinne did not care about appearance. She cared about whether the grain was straight and the wood was dry and the species was right. She picked through the coal pile for an hour, checking each board by sighting down its edge the way her father had taught her, rejecting anything with a twist or a crown that would fight the layout instead of following it. On all 3 counts, the culls she chose were perfect. The frame went up on dry, stacked stone piers pulled from Opal's own creek bed. Flat-bottomed stones the size of bread loaves, carried up the ridge 2 at a time in a 5-gallon bucket, stacked without mortar in columns 3 feet high. She dug the pier holes with a post hole digger borrowed from Opal's machine shed, going down below the frost line in each location, setting the first stone on undisturbed clay and building up from there. A stone pier does not rot. It does not shift if you seat it on undisturbed ground below the frost line, and it costs nothing except labor, which was the one resource Corinne had in unlimited supply. She built 9 piers in 3 days. Her back hurt so badly on the 3rd evening that she lay on the ground next to Boone and stared at the sky until the pain eased enough to walk down the hill. Then came the moment the whole project almost ended. Raising the heavy bent frames alone was the part she had been dreading since the first day she bid on that shed. A bent frame is the structural arch that forms one cross-section of the building, and the main bents on this shed weighed well over 300 pounds each. They need to go from horizontal on the ground to vertical on the sill beams, and in a traditional barn, raising that job takes 8 to 12 men with pike poles and ropes and someone calling the count. Corinne had no men, no pike poles, and no one to call the count. She rigged a temporary system of blocking and leverage, got the first frame halfway up, and felt it start to go wrong. The base kicked on the sill beam, the top swung sideways, and 300 pounds of white oak came down hard, slamming into the ground 1 foot from her left leg, with a sound she would hear in her sleep for weeks. She sat in the grass next to Boone for a long time after that. The dog leaned against her hip, and she put her hand on his back and felt his ribs moving, and listened to her own heartbeat gradually slow from the hammering panic to something like normal. She looked at the bent frame lying in the grass, and she looked at the 3 remaining frames still on the ground, and she understood that if she tried the same method again, one of them would kill her, not might, would. Then she got up. She walked down to Opal's machine shed. In the back corner, behind a stack of fence posts and a roll of barbed wire, she found a hand crank come along winch with a 20-foot chain. She carried it up the ridge, anchored the chain around the trunk of a walnut tree that was older than anything on that property, and cranked the bent frame upright a few clicks at a time. Slow, controlled, nothing held overhead, nobody standing under anything. Each click of the ratchet moved the frame 2 inches. It took 45 minutes to raise one bend. She raised all 4 that way, alone, over 2 days, and every peg went home into the same numbered joint it had come out of. The following week, Wade Kettner came up the gravel road in his truck. Wade farmed 2 properties over from Opal, and he had been watching the trailer loads of timber going up the hill with the same suspicion that a man develops after 50 years of seeing strangers show up in rural places with plans that never work out the way they promise. He did not come to see Corinne. He came to see Opal. Corinne was on the ridge checking a joint when she heard Wade's voice carry up from the porch. He was not yelling. He did not need to. His voice had the flat, carrying quality of a man who is used to being heard across a pasture. "You have got a stranger building, God knows what, on your back ridge," he said, "and you do not even have it in writing." Opal's voice came back steady and undisturbed. She told him she knew exactly what she was doing, and she had been making decisions about this land since before Wade bought his first tractor. Wade left without saying goodbye. His truck kicked gravel on the way down the hill. Corinne stood on the ridge, holding a wooden mallet, and understood that the world around Opal's 40 acres was paying attention now, and not all of it was friendly. The roof cost nothing but labor. Wade Kettner had a collapsed dairy barn on his lower pasture that he had been meaning to deal with for the better part of a decade. The tin was still good. 70-year-old galvanized steel, buckled where the ridge beam gave way, but not rusted through. When Corinne asked about it, Wade studied her for a while, then told her she was welcome to every sheet on that barn as long as she hauled off everything she stripped. He said it the way a man says something when he is testing whether the person he is talking to actually means what they say. She meant it. She spent 3 days pulling tin off that collapsed barn with a pry bar and a pair of work gloves, stacking sheets on the borrowed trailetis, hauling them up the ridge, and screwing them down over fresh purlins she had cut from cedar poles. The barn roof had not leaked in 70 years, and the shed roof has not leaked in 4. And something shifted in Wade Kettner during those 3 days. He came by twice, not check on Opal, but to watch Corinne work. She did not talk much while she worked. She did not complain about the heat or the weight of the tin or the wasps that had colonized the barn's south wall. She just stripped and stacked and hauled and screwed, and Wade watched a woman do in 3 days what he had been putting off for 10 years. He did not say anything approving, but he stopped saying anything disapproving, and in a place like Howell County, that is the first step toward trust. Then came a visitor Corinne had not expected, and Opal had not invited. Nadine Orfila drove down from Tulsa on a Wednesday without calling ahead. She pulled into Opal's driveway in a silver SUV that looked like it had never been on a gravel road before, and she stood in the yard looking at her mother's property with the expression of someone doing an inspection rather than paying a visit. The garden was cleared. The ragweed was gone. The fence lines were mended with new wire pulled tight. The firewood was split and stacked in a cord pile taller than the porch railing. All of that should have pleased a daughter worried about her mother living alone. But Nadine's eyes went past the garden and the fence and the firewood and found the timber frame standing on the ridge behind the house, half sheeted in tin, clearly becoming something more than a storage shed. She found Corinne coming down the ridge path with a bucket of creek stones and stopped her on the trail. "Who are you?" she said. "Not hello. Not thank you for fixing my mother's fence. Who are you, and what exactly is your arrangement with my mother?" Corinne set the bucket down and explained. The handshake, the work exchange, the shed on the ridge. She kept her voice the same way she kept it when she talked to Jess, level and careful and stripped of anything that could be mistaken for begging. Nadine listened without interrupting, and then she said something that landed like a stone dropped into still water. "My mother is 81 years old, and she is handing out land to strangers. That is not generosity. That is a sign she needs supervised care." From the porch, Opal's voice cut through the afternoon air. She had been listening from behind the screen door. "Nadine, I gave her permission. You can either help or you can go home." Nadine looked at her mother. She looked at Corinne. She looked at the ridge where the frame stood against the sky. Then she said, "This is not over," and she walked to her silver SUV and drove down the gravel road without looking back. Corinne watched the dust settle behind the vehicle and felt something cold move through her chest. She had survived losing her job, her home, her daughter's regard, and a 300-pound beam falling next to her leg. But this was different. This was a woman with resources and motivation, and the particular dangerous focus of someone who believes they are protecting a parent when they are really protecting an inheritance. A sealed metal building in the Ozarks does not fight the desert's enemy. It fights humidity. Southern Missouri summer air carries water like a soaked sponge, and winter nights fall below zero. And a building that swings between those two extremes without protection turns into a mold farm by its second year. Warm, damp air finds a cold surface, condenses, and rains slowly onto everything a person owns until the framing streaks black and the mattress belongs in a burn pile. Corinne fought it the way a commercial crew would, except with materials that cost almost nothing. Every big construction job cuts rigid foam insulation board to fit and throws the leftovers in a dumpster. Corinne asked at 3 active job sites around West Plains and spent 5 weeks hauling partial sheets of foam until she had enough to wrap the entire interior, trimmed to fit with a utility knife. Before the foam went up, she stapled a layer of 6 mil plastic sheeting across every stud bay. $24 of plastic standing guard between the warm, wet air of daily life and every cold surface behind it. Under the roof tin, she added a foil-faced radiant barrier. $45. That barrier knocks down the August attic heat before it reaches the living space. And in January, it reflects the stove heat back down instead of letting it bleed through the metal roof into the sky. 4 humid summers and 4 freezing winters later, there is no mold in that building anywhere, and the cheapest material in the whole project is the reason. Heat came from a cast iron box stove she found at a scrap metal yard outside West Plains, sitting in a pile of old radiators and car parts with one cracked leg. The yard sold it to her at scrap weight. Carl knew a welder named Hollis who fixed the leg for $25 and welded a new damper handle while he was at it. The stove worked perfectly, but the chimney is the one place where Corinne refused to save money. She paid $84 full retail for brand new insulated stovepipe at the hardware store because a salvaged stove is a smart bargain and a salvaged flue is how people die in their sleep. Carbon monoxide does not knock. It does not give you a second chance. She bought new pipe and she slept soundly. And on January nights, that stove heats the insulated shed so thoroughly that she cracks a window to let the cool air in. 2 weeks after the stove went in, Corinne came down the ridge one morning to find an unfamiliar truck in Opal's driveway and a woman she had never seen standing at the porch with a clipboard. Lorraine Sisk, Howell County Code Enforcement. Someone had filed a complaint about unpermitted construction on the property. Corinne felt the ground shift under her feet the way it had shifted when she read the rent increase letter in her kitchen a lifetime ago. Lorraine was polite. She was professional. She walked the property, looked at the shed, made notes on her clipboard, and told Corinne She would be back with an official determination. She did not say who had filed the complaint. She did not need to. Corinne watched the county truck roll down the gravel road and stood there in the morning cold with her hands in her jacket, pockets feeling something worse than fear. It was the particular helplessness of realizing that the person trying to destroy what you have built does not need to use force. They just need to use the system. Nadine had not come back to argue with her mother. She had gone around her mother entirely and aimed the machinery of county government at a woman with no permit, no lawyer, and no standing to fight anything except with her own two hands. The days that followed were the hardest of the entire build. Not physically. Physically, the hard part was over. The frame was up and the roof was on and the walls were going in. The hard part now was the waiting. Every morning, Corinne woke in the minivan and looked up at the frame on the ridge and wondered if today was the day someone would tell her to take it all down. She kept working because stopping would mean giving up, and giving up was not something her hands knew how to do. But the work had a different quality now. Every nail she drove felt provisional. Every board she cut felt like something she might have to pull out and stack for hauling. She ate less. She talked less. She started checking the road every time she heard an engine coming up the gravel, looking for the white county truck with the seal on the door. She went 3 days without driving to town because she did not want to leave the property unattended, in case Lorraine came back while she was gone. Opal noticed. The old woman did not say much about it. She was not the kind of person who asks questions when she can see the answer standing in front of her. But she started leaving a plate of food on the porch railing. Every evening, covered with a kitchen towel, fried potatoes and onions, a piece of cornbread, sliced tomatoes from the garden that Corinne had cleared and replanted. Sometimes a jar of canned peaches from the basement pantry where Opal kept the work of 20 summers lined up on shelves that Wallace had built. She never once mentioned it. She never asked whether Corinne had eaten, or whether she was all right, or whether she wanted to talk about what was happening. She just left the plate on the railing, the way you leave water out for an animal that has not yet decided to trust you. And every evening Corinne carried that plate up the ridge and ate sitting on the porch of her unfinished shed with Boone beside her. And the food was always good and the silence was always enough. Then Lorraine came back. She parked in the same spot and walked the property again, this time with a measuring tape. She measured the shed's footprint. She checked the distance from the nearest property line. She looked at the electrical connections, of which there were none, and the plumbing connections, of which there were also none. Then she put the clipboard under her arm and walked up the ridge and stood inside the frame. She was quiet for a while. She looked at the joints. She looked at the pegs. She ran her hand along the same beam Corinne had touched in the auction shed on the day. She decided to bet her last money on a building nobody wanted. Then Lorraine said something that changed the weight of the entire week. Farm outbuildings under a certain square footage threshold on agricultural land in Howell County do not require a building permit if they are not connected to municipal water or power. The shed fell under the threshold. The land was zoned agricultural. There were no utility connections of any kind. Whoever built this original frame knew what they were doing, Lorraine said. So do you. Then she added one more thing. If anyone files a complaint about occupancy rather than agricultural storage, the conversation will be different. She let that sentence sit in the air between them for a moment. Then she walked back to her truck and drove away. Corinne stood on the ridge and let herself breathe. The building was safe, for now. But Lorraine's final sentence was a warning wrapped in a courtesy. Nadine had one more angle of attack available, and if she used it, the rules would change. The warning did not stay hypothetical for long. 9 days later, Lorraine Sisk came back up the gravel road. This time she carried a different form, clipped to the front of her board, and Corinne knew before the county truck stopped that somebody had found the next lever. A second complaint had been filed, this one alleging that the farm outbuilding was being used as a permanent dwelling without proper sanitation, emergency access, or safe heating. Lorraine said the complaint did not automatically mean Corinne had to leave. It meant the county had to document what was actually there. Corinne felt the old panic rise. The same panic that had followed the hospital letter and the rent increase and every other piece of official paper that had arrived after her injury. But this time she had a structure she understood from the sill beams to the ridge. She had Opal standing beside her, and she had learned that a form was not a verdict. Lorraine checked the stove clearances, the insulated chimney pipe, the opening window, the smoke alarm, the carbon monoxide alarm, and the simple sanitation system. Corinne showed her receipts and explained exactly how the sealed waste containers were handled and kept away from the spring food gardens. She did not dress the system up. She simply showed that she had thought through every risk. Lorraine said residential use changed the review even when the building itself remained below the farm structure permit threshold. She would need to check the county file and speak with environmental health. Then Opal stepped forward. "This is my land," she said. "I invited her here. I know she sleeps in that building. If there is something unsafe, tell us what it is and we will fix it. But do not talk about her as if she snuck onto my hill in the night." Lorraine lowered the clipboard. "I am not saying that, Mrs. Rankin." "Then write down that I said it." Lorraine did. 2 days later, she called the feed store and asked Corinne to come by the county office. Corinne went during her lunch break and sat across from Lorraine under fluorescent lights, waiting for the sentence that would decide whether she still had a home. The county was not ordering her out. There were conditions, but none required dismantling the shed. The alarms and stove installation had to remain documented. The waste system had to stay away from the spring and food production. Any future permanent plumbing or major utility change would require a new review. Corinne read the page twice. Lorraine watched her. "Most people get angry when I tell them they have conditions. Most people have not spent a year waiting for someone to tell them they have nowhere to sleep." Lorraine's expression softened. Whoever keeps filing these complaints is running out of useful complaints. Corinne looked up. Lorraine did not tell her who had filed them. She did not need to. She closed the file and said, "Keep your receipts. Keep your systems clean. And if you change something, ask before you build it." That evening, Corinne showed the letter to Opal. Opal read it, handed it back, and said, "Good. Now fix the loose board on my back steps before I break my neck and give my daughter something real to complain about." Corinne laughed before she could stop herself. Then she got the hammer. Water turned out to be the gift of the land itself, and in solving it was the one part of the build that made Corinne laugh out loud, which she had not done in months. $42 of aluminum gutter along both eaves fed two 275-gallon food-grade IBC totes that a West Plains bakery gave away when it replaced its syrup containers. The totes were still sticky with corn syrup residue when Corinne loaded them into the borrowed trailer, and she spent an afternoon rinsing them with a garden hose at Opal's house before hauling them up the ridge. Window screen over the inlets kept the leaves and mosquitoes out. She ran the downspouts into a simple first flush diverter made from a capped PVC pipe that caught the first few gallons of roof runoff, the dirty water full of dust and bird droppings, and diverted it to the ground before the clean water flowed into the totes. One good spring thunderstorm filled both totes before supper. That water handled washing, cleaning, the garden, and the tub. Drinking water came from the ground. There was an old stone spring box on that ridge. The very reason Opal's husband's grandfather had chosen the hill in the first place. The reason he had picked this specific ridge out of all the ridges on all the hills in Howell County. The spring had been silted completely full when Corinne found it, buried under decades of leaf litter and runoff sediment. The capstone had shifted sideways. The outlet was clogged with clay and root matter. But underneath the silt, the stone walls were still sound, laid dry without mortar, in the way that Ozark farmers built things when they meant them to last longer than themselves. One weekend, with a shovel and a bucket and a pair of leather gloves, a relaid capstone shimmed level with flat creek stones, and cold, clear water ran through it the way it had been running for 100 years before anyone built a house below it. The water was clean and cold and tasted like the rock it came through, a faint mineral sweetness that no municipal pipe would ever carry. She filtered and boiled what they drank. Her entire annual water cost was bleach and a replacement filter, under $30 in a country where plenty of households pay double that every single month. Electricity came from broken glass. Solar installers constantly pull hail-damaged and warranty-swapped panels off rooftops. And a cracked panel still pushing 60% of its original rating is the disposal fee to a company and free wattage to anyone patient enough to ask. A solar outfit across the state line in Mountain Home, Arkansas told Corinne to take 3 damaged panels off their hands at no charge. She built a south-facing wooden rack from scrap lumber, ran the panels through a cheap charge controller into a pair of used deep-cycle batteries from a marine salvage lot, and taught herself 12-volt wiring from library books. Copying the diagrams onto a legal pad, she carried up the ridge in her jacket pocket. The system covered LED lighting, a radio, and phone charging. It was enough. Corinne hung 3 LED strips inside the shed and wired them through a switch she mounted next to the door. And the first night she turned them on and stood in the doorway looking at a room lit by sunlight that had been collected 8 hours earlier and stored in batteries salvaged from a boat that someone had given up on. It was enough light to read by. It was enough light to cook by. It was enough. And then it was not enough because Boone got sick. She noticed it first on a Monday morning when he drank from his bowl 3 times in an hour and then went out and urinated against the porch post and came back and drank again. He had been losing weight. His ribs were showing in a way they had not shown before. He was 9 years old, and Corinne had assumed the changes were age, the normal slowing of a dog who had spent 9 years working harder than most dogs ever work. But this was different. This was thirst that could not be satisfied, and weight that fell away despite a full bowl twice a day. The vet in West Plains was a young woman named Dr. Poole, who charged $35 for an office visit, and who looked at Boone's blood work and told Corinne what she was already afraid of hearing. Diabetes, the kind that required insulin injections twice a day for the rest of his life. The insulin had to stay cold. Not cool, not shaded, cold. Constant refrigeration between 36 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit. And Corinne's 3 cracked solar panels and 2 full marine batteries could not run a refrigerator of any size without draining flat by midnight. She stood in the vet's parking lot, holding the first vial of insulin and the cold pack it came in, and did the math the way she always did, silently and without asking anyone for help. The cold pack would last 8 hours. After that, the insulin was useless. A vial cost $42, and she could not afford to lose a single dose to heat exposure. And without the insulin, the dog who had been her only family for 9 years would die in a way that was slow and painful and entirely preventable if she could just keep a small box cold. She did not cry in the parking lot. She got in the minivan and drove home and sat on the ridge with the insulin vial in her hand and the cold pack melting beside her and thought about the problem the way she thought about every problem. Not as a disaster, as a construction challenge. What does the system need? What is available? What can be found for free or close to it? She drove back to Mountain Home the next morning. The solar company had 4 more damaged panels sitting against the back wall of their warehouse, cracked from a hailstorm that had swept through the county 2 months earlier. They told her the same thing they had told her the first time. Just take them. The warehouse manager even helped her load them into the minivan, leaning the panels against the passenger seat at an angle that Boone found insulting but tolerated. She built a second rack from scrap lumber, oriented 12 degrees off the first rack to catch a slightly different solar window. She wired the new panels into the existing system through a second charge controller she bought used for $15 from an online listing, added a third battery she found at a farm auction for $12, and calculated the load with a notebook and a pencil until she was certain a small 12-volt cooler could run through the night without pulling the system below 50% charge. She ran the numbers 3 times. She checked the amp-hour ratings on every battery. She calculated the worst-case scenario, 3 consecutive cloudy days in January, and confirmed the system could carry the cooler through all 3 without supplemental charging. The cooler arrived from a discount website. $31 including shipping. It was not a refrigerator. It was a box barely large enough to hold a gallon of milk and a few items. but it held butter, milk, and Boone's insulin at a steady 40 degrees. And from that day forward, his medicine never had to compete with a tank of gas for priority. She sat on the ridge that evening with Boone lying next to her, and the cooler humming softly inside the shed behind them, and she understood something about the shape of what she had built. She had not set out to make a statement or prove a theory about off-grid living. She had not set out to build a model home or a demonstration project or a YouTube video. She had set out to keep a dog alive and a roof overhead and the cold away from her bones at night. Every system in that building existed because a specific problem demanded a specific solution, and every solution had been found in the same place, in the things other people threw away or wrote off or could not be bothered to haul to the dump. The toilet was the humble half of the bathroom. 2 5-gallon buckets, a hinged plywood seat, and pine shavings from the feed store. $15 to set up. About $40 a year to run. Full buckets got sealed and set aside behind the shed to cure for 6 months or longer, because Missouri sun is not desert sun, and you do not rush that process. The finished compost went on flower beds only, never on food. The other half of the bathroom became the crown of the entire build. While Corinne was stripping tin off Wade Kettner's collapsed dairy barn, she found a cast-iron clawfoot bathtub, half buried in 40 years of stall bedding, where it had spent its retirement as a livestock water trough. The cattle had drunk from it. The stall bedding had packed around it. The enamel was gone on the inside, and the feet were caked in decades of barn grime. Wade looked at it and laughed and waved his hand the way you wave away, something that is not worth the breath to discuss. Corinne saw something else. She saw weight, which meant the iron was thick. She saw the claw feet, which meant it was old enough to be real cast iron, not the thin pressed steel that replaced it. She saw a bathtub that had survived 40 years of neglect and livestock abuse, and was still structurally perfect because cast iron does not care about your opinion of it. Vinegar and a wire brush, and 3 days of scrubbing. $9 of black enamel spray paint on the outside. A $20 salvage double-pane window installed in the wall above it. In summer, a coil of black polyethylene pipe on the shed roof heats bath water with nothing but sunlight. In winter, stock pots go on the wood stove, and Corinne carries them across the room and pours them into the tub one at a time until the water is deep and hot. On a February night, lying in that water, in a cast-iron tub that cattle drank from for 4 decades, watching snow fall through the window over the valley below, Corinne Hadley takes a bath that no apartment she ever rented could have given her at any price. She had a home. She had heat and water and light, and a dog whose insulin stayed cold. She had a job that was starting to feel like a place she belonged, rather than a place she was tolerated. And that should have been the end of the hardest part. But Corinne Hadley's life had taught her one thing above all others, which is that the hardest part is never the part you are prepared for. The hardest part is the one that arrives after you think the worst is over. 3 days after the first snowfall, an envelope arrived in Opal's mailbox that was not a bill and not a letter from a friend. It was from a law office in Springfield, a firm name Corinne did not recognize, addressed to Opal Rankin. And it used language that Corinne recognized the way a person recognizes the sound of a gun being cocked, even if they have never heard it before. Legal language, clinical language, the kind of language that reduces a human being to a list of symptoms and deficiencies. The letter requested a formal competency evaluation of Opal Rankin. It cited the granting of land use rights to an unrelated party without a written contract. It cited the deteriorated condition of the property's fence lines prior to recent repairs, as if the fact that the fences had been down was evidence of cognitive decline rather than evidence of a woman who could not replace fence wire by herself at 81 years old. It referenced the handshake agreement with Corinne as a sign of undue influence, consistent with diminished cognitive capacity. And at the bottom, above the signature of an attorney retained by Nadine Orfila, there was a paragraph requesting that the court appoint a guardian ad litem to evaluate Mrs. Rankin's ability to manage her own affairs. Opal read that letter standing in her kitchen. She read it once quickly, and then she read it again slowly, moving her finger under each line the way a person does when they want to make sure they are not misunderstanding something that sounds too terrible to be real. Her hands trembled, but not from weakness and not from confusion. Her hands trembled because she was angrier than Corinne had ever seen another human being. And Corinne had seen people get fired and evicted and told that their insurance would not cover the surgery they had already undergone. Opal set the letter on the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the surface and stood there looking at the page the way you look at a thing that has betrayed you in a way you did not think was possible. "She is trying to prove I am senile," Opal said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "My own daughter. The girl I taught to can tomatoes and plant garlic and balance a checkbook. She is trying to prove I cannot make my own decisions so she can sell this place out from under me, so she can sell the ground where her father is buried." Corinne stood in the kitchen doorway and watched this woman who had never asked anyone for permission to live on her own land, who had buried her husband and kept the fence lines up and the taxes paid and the garden planted every spring for 62 years, stand at her own kitchen table and face the possibility that her own client was willing to declare her incompetent to get control of 40 acres of Ozark hill country. The silence in that kitchen was the kind of silence that has weight. Corinne could feel it pressing against her chest. She could feel the unfairness of it, the cruelty of a system that allows a daughter to weaponize love and concern and filial obligation against a mother who has done nothing wrong except grow old on her own land. Then Corinne said what she had been thinking since the moment Lorraine Sisk's truck first appeared in the driveway. She told Opal that if her presence on this land was putting Opal's ownership at risk, she would take the shed apart and leave. She would carry every beam back down the hill and find somewhere else, and Opal would never have to explain Corinne to anyone again. She meant it, every word. She would rather sleep in the minivan for another winter than be the reason an 81-year-old woman lost her home. Opal looked at her across the kitchen. She looked at Corinne the way she had looked at her on the first day, when Corinne stood on the porch and made her offer, and Opal studied her the way you study a piece of timber before you decide whether it will hold weight. Then Opal said no, in a voice that left no room for discussion and no space for argument, and no possibility that she might be talked out of what she was about to say. "You are the only person in 2 years who has fixed anything on this land, instead of trying to take it from me. You are not going anywhere, and neither am I." That letter sat on Opal's kitchen table for the rest of the week. Corinne saw it every time she came in through the kitchen door, lying next to the salt shaker and the napkin holder, folded once and weighted down with a coffee mug as if Opal was daring it to move. And somewhere in Tulsa, Nadine Orfila was waiting for a response, certain that the legal weight of a competency evaluation would be enough to break her mother's resistance. She did not know that she had just given 2 women, on a gravel road, the only thing they needed to fight back, which was a reason to stop being careful and start being prepared. Corinne drove Opal to West Plains on a Monday morning. They took the minivan because Opal said she was not going to meet a lawyer in a truck that smelled like feed bags, and because the minivan's heater still worked, even if nothing else about it inspired confidence. Boone rode in the back seat with his chin on the armrest, watching the road the way he always did, cataloging fence lines and cattle and mailboxes, as if filing them for future reference. The lawyer's name was Harlan Bryce. He worked out of a small office above a hardware store on the main street in West Plains, a second-floor walk-up with a window that looked out over the courthouse square. He was in his late 60s himself, a man who had practiced property and estate law in Howell County for 35 years, and who understood the particular kind of damage that families do to each other when land and money and aging parents occupy the same conversation. He read Nadine's letter twice. The second time he read it more slowly, pausing at certain phrases and making small marks in the margin with a pencil. Then he set it down and looked at Opal the way a doctor looks at a patient before delivering a diagnosis, not with pity but with careful attention. He took off his reading glasses and held them in one hand and asked Opal a series of questions. Did she know what day it was? Did she know the current president? Could she describe the terms of her property tax payment schedule, including the amount, the due dates, and the method of payment. Could she explain the arrangement she had made with Corinne and why she had made it? Could she describe her daily routine? Could she list her medications and their dosages? Could she explain what would happen to her property if she died without a will? Opal answered every question with the precise, unhurried clarity of a woman who had been managing 40 acres, a household, and her own finances since the Eisenhower administration. She told him her property tax was paid annually at the county collector's office in West Plains, and she had never once been late in 62 years. She told him her medications were a blood pressure pill in the morning and an aspirin at night, and she had not missed a dose in 4 years. She told him she had a will filed with the county clerk that left everything to Nadine because Nadine was her only child, but that the will did not include the right to sell the land while Opal was still living on it. And if it did, she would change it tomorrow. Harlan Bryce closed his notepad and set his pencil on the desk and looked at Opal for a moment with an expression that was close to admiration. Then he told her the truth. Nadine could not compel a competency evaluation without a court order, and a court order required evidence of specific cognitive decline documented by a medical professional. A letter from an attorney citing deteriorated fence lines and a handshake land agreement did not meet that standard. Opal Rankin was not confused. She was not diminished. She was a property owner making decisions about her own land, which was her absolute legal right. He sent a response to Nadine's Springfield attorney that afternoon. Corinne did not read it, but she saw the expression on Harlan's face when he described what he had written. And it was the expression of a man who had enjoyed his work that day. But Harlan also told Opal something she did not want to hear. The handshake agreement with Corinne was legally fragile. If Nadine escalated further, or if Opal's health changed, or if the property entered probate, Corinne's right to occupy the ridge could evaporate in a single hearing. He recommended a written agreement. Something simple, something filed with the county, something that would survive a challenge. Opal was quiet on the drive home. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the hills roll past the window and did not speak until Corinne turned onto the gravel road that led up to the farm. Then she said, "I am not going to let a piece of paper be the reason my daughter thinks she lost. Let me think about this." Corinne did not push. She had learned a long time ago that pushing people toward decisions they were not ready to make was the fastest way to lose them, and she could not afford to lose Opal. Not now, not over paperwork. The following Saturday, Wade Kettner's truck came up the gravel road again. This time he did not go to the porch. He walked up the ridge trail and found Corinne splitting kindling next to the shed. He stood there for a moment, watching her work the way he had watched her strip his barn, silently, and with the particular attention of a man evaluating whether someone knows what they are doing. Then he said something Corinne did not expect. He told her he had been wrong about her. He said he had watched her work on this property for months, and what he had seen was not a stranger taking advantage of an old woman. What he had seen was the only person in 2 years who had done a single useful thing on this land. The garden was producing again. The fence lines were tight. The firewood was stacked higher and straighter than Wallace Rankin himself had ever stacked it. And Wade would know because he had borrowed wood from Wallace twice in the winters before Wallace died. He said one more thing. If Nadine Orfila ever took this to a courtroom, he would drive to West Plains and sit in the witness chair and tell any judge in the state that Opal Rankin was the sharpest 81-year-old in Howell County and that Corinne Hadley had earned her place on that ridge with labor that most men half her age would not have survived. Then he left. He walked back down the ridge trail without looking back and got in his truck and drove away. He did not ask for thanks, and Corinne did not offer any because in that part of the Ozarks, a man can saying he was wrong out loud is already more than most people get in a lifetime. But she stood there for a while after his truck disappeared down the gravel road, holding the kindling hatchet in her hand, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt seen, not pitied, not rescued, not admired from a safe distance, seen by a man who had spent his entire life judging people by what they did rather than what they said, and who had just told her that what she did was enough. Carl Jessup hired Corinne 3 days a week at the feed store the following month. It was not charity, and Carl made that clear the first morning. He hired her because she knew livestock feed the way someone does it when they grew up scooping it into troughs and measuring it by weight and smell instead of reading the label. She knew the difference between a 16% protein cattle cube and a 14% by rolling it between her fingers. She could tell a customer which mineral block to use for clay soil pasture without looking it up. Carl had been running the counter alone since his previous employee moved to Branson, and he needed someone who could handle the Friday the Shrink morning rush when every rancher in the county came in at the same time. The paycheck was small, but it was steady, and steady was a word that had disappeared from Corinne's life 14 months earlier. She opened a savings account at the credit union in West Plains with her first check. The teller asked if she wanted direct deposit. Corinne said she preferred to bring the check in person because she wanted to see the number go up with her own eyes. The job also showed Corinne what the county was saying about her. On her second Friday, a cattleman from the southern end of the county came to the counter for mineral blocks and asked, with the false casualness of someone repeating a story he hoped was true, whether Corinne was the woman living free on an old widow's land. Corinne kept writing the sale ticket. "I work for my place there." The man smiled. "That is not what I heard. I heard Mrs. Rankin is giving you the ridge because her daughter is not around enough to stop it." Carl looked up from the loading door, but Corinne answered before he could. "Then you heard wrong." The man shrugged. "People are talking. An 81-year-old woman signs things for a stranger. People are going to wonder." Corinne felt heat move up her neck. For months, she had answered official questions with receipts, measurements, work, and patience. Rumor was harder because rumor did not need evidence. It only needed repetition. Before she could respond, Wade Kettner came through the front door carrying a broken gate latch he wanted Carl to replace. He had heard enough. "Opal Rankin knows exactly what she is doing," Wade said. "And Corinne has put more work into that place in 6 months than most relatives put into a family farm in 6 years. The cattleman turned. "I was only saying what people are saying." "Then say something else." Wade set the latch on the counter. The room went quiet. The cattleman paid for his mineral blocks and left without another word. Corinne stared at the ticket book. "You did not have to do that." Wade picked up the replacement latch Carl handed him. "Yes, I did. I was one of the people talking before I knew better." Then he left. Carl waited until the door closed. "That is how a reputation changes around here," he said. "Not all at once. One person decides to correct the story when you are not in the room." Corinne looked through the front window at Wade's truck pulling away. For most of her life, she had believed dignity meant needing no one to speak for you. She was beginning to understand that sometimes dignity also meant having lived in a way that made decent people unwilling to stay silent when somebody lied about it. It was Carl who told her about the developer. He mentioned it the way people in small towns mention things, sideways and without fanfare, while restacking bags of horse feed on a Tuesday afternoon. He said a man from Springfield had been asking around about land values north of town. Hill country, 40-acre parcels. The man had a business card from a development company, and he had been talking to a couple of property owners about purchasing options. Carl said the man's name did not matter, but the woman who had given him Opal's name, an acreage and approximate location did matter because it was Nadine. Corinne set down the bag she was carrying and stood very still in the feed store aisle. The store was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A barn cat that had lived under the front porch for 3 years walked across the floor between them and disappeared behind the stacked pallets of chicken scratch. Carl did not look at her. He kept stacking. He said Pastor Foss had heard the same thing from a real estate broker at the Rotary breakfast, and a cattle farmer named Jennings who owned 80 acres adjacent to Opal's spread had been approached by the same developer. The man had a map. He had property lines drawn on it, and he had Opal's 40 acres circled. Carl said the developer was interested in the ridge specifically because the ridge had a year-round spring and a view that went on for miles. And those two things together on a hilltop in the Ozarks were worth more per acre than flat farmland, by a factor that would make a person's head spin. Nadine had not just been pushing assisted living to protect her mother. She had been in contact with a development company that wanted to buy Opal's 40 acres, and the price discussings was significant enough to explain every phone call, every visit, every legal letter, and every complaint to county code enforcement. It was enough money to pay off 2 mortgages in Tulsa and leave change. It was enough money to make a daughter forget that her father was buried on the property she was trying to sell. The assisted living argument was real, but it was the door, not the destination. The destination was the land. Nadine needed Opal in a facility because Nadine needed control of the property, and she needed control of the property because she needed the money. The competency evaluation was not about Opal's mind. It was about Opal's signature on a power of attorney form that would give Nadine the legal authority to sell 40 acres to the highest bidder while her mother ate institutional meals in a room that smelled like disinfectant. Corinne drove up the gravel road that evening and parked the minivan and sat on the ridge with Boone and looked out over the valley and made a decision that surprised her. She decided not to tell Opal, not yet. Not because Opal did not deserve to know, but because Corinne understood what that information would do to an 81-year-old woman who had already spent a week staring at a letter that accused her of losing her mind. Corinne had watched her own life collapse because of information that arrived all at once and left no time to breathe between blows. The job, the bills, the rent, the daughter. Each one had landed before the last one stopped hurting. She was not going to do that to Opal. Learning that her only daughter was trying to sell the land where her husband was buried would not arm Opal. It would break something inside her that might not mend, and a broken Opal would be exactly what Nadine needed. A broken Opal would look like the confused, diminished woman that the Springfield attorney's letter described. The cruelest part of the whole arrangement was that the weapon Nadine was using against her mother would work best if her mother was hurt badly enough to show it. Corinne would hold the information. She would wait, and if Nadine came back, Corinne would be ready. The developer arrived before Nadine did. It happened on a Thursday afternoon while Corinne was at the feed store. Opal was alone when a dark blue pickup with Springfield plates stopped beside the machine shed. The man who stepped out wore a jacket with Ridgeway Land Development stitched over the pocket and carried a tablet and a rolled survey map. He introduced himself as Mason Pruitt and said he was there to take a preliminary look at the acreage before the family made a decision. Opal asked him which family. He said he had been speaking with her daughter about a possible purchase. Nothing binding, just an evaluation. He complimented the view, the spring, and the road access. Parcels like this were becoming desirable for small cabin developments. Opal listened without interrupting. Mason unrolled the map on the hood of his truck. Her 40 acres were outlined in red. The rear ridge was divided into proposed lots. A thin black line marked a future access road that ran directly across the path to Corinne's shed. Opal asked who had authorized him to survey her property. He said Nadine had represented herself as the family contact and future decision-maker. "Did she tell you I agreed to sell?" He hesitated. "No, ma'am. She said the family was discussing options. There is no family discussion. There is me. I own this land." Mason started to roll the map back up. "Leave that," Opal said. "Ma'am, this is company material. You brought a map of my land onto my land while discussing a sale I never agreed to. Leave it." Mason looked toward the ridge where Corinne's roof showed through the trees. "Is that the structure your daughter mentioned? What did she say about it?" "Only that there was an unauthorized occupant complicating the property." Opal's voice went flat. "Get off my land." Mason did not argue. He drove away. When Corinne returned from work, Opal was sitting at the kitchen table with the Ridgeway map spread in front of her. Corinne stopped in the doorway. "You knew," Opal said. Corinne set down her lunch pail. "Carl told me 3 weeks ago I decided to wait." "Why?" "Because you had just gotten the competency letter. I thought hearing this at the same time would hurt you in exactly the way Nadine needed you to look hurt if she ever put you in front of a judge." Opal stared at the map. "You decided what I could handle." Corinne had no defense that did not sound like the same thing Nadine had been doing. "Yes, After a long silence, Opal folded the map once. Do not do that again. I will not. If something concerns my land or my daughter, you tell me. I can be angry and still know what day it is. Corinne nodded. Then Opal said, drive me to town tomorrow. They went to Harlan Bryce's office the next morning. Opal carried the map under her arm. Harlan asked whether she had signed any listing agreement, purchase option, letter of intent, or power of attorney. No to all of it. Then your daughter cannot sell this land, he said. She can talk to developers, but without your signature or lawful authority, she cannot transfer 1 acre. Opal asked about Corinne. Harlan reminded them that the handshake arrangement was fragile. If Opal wanted it to survive pressure from Nadine, illness, probate, or a future buyer, it needed to be written. Opal asked for the narrowest possible agreement. Not ownership, not a deed, just the right for Corinne to occupy the rear ridge and maintain the structure there for as long as she chose, subject to reasonable care of the property. Harlan said he could draft that. Corinne spoke. I do not want her land. I will sign something that protects the shed and my right to stay, but I will not take title. I will not let anyone say I came up that hill waiting for her to get old enough to give me 40 acres. Harlan nodded. Draft it, Opal said. Harlan reached for a legal pad. Opal stopped him. I said draft it. I did not say I was signing it today. The old lawyer smiled. On the drive home, Opal was quiet for several miles. Then she said, you were wrong not to tell me. I know. But if I had learned about this the same day that competency letter arrived, I might have driven to Tulsa and done something that would have looked very bad in a court. Corinne laughed. Opal did too. The anger did not disappear. Neither did the hurt. But by the time they reached the gravel road, they were speaking again about the south fence, Stovewood, and Boone chewing through the handle of Opal's garden trowel. And in Harlan Bryce's office, a legal pad now held the first rough language of the document Nadine would not know existed until she laid a power of attorney form on her mother's kitchen table. Nadine came back 3 weeks later. She arrived on a Saturday morning, driving the same silver SUV, and this time she brought documents, a folder, a brochure from an assisted living facility in Joplin, with photographs of sunny rooms and smiling staff, and a single-page legal form granting Nadine power of attorney over Opal's financial and property decisions. She sat at Opal's kitchen table and laid everything out with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. She told Opal the letter from Harlan Bryce did not change the underlying concern. She told her mother that living alone at 81 was a risk that would only grow. She told her the facility in Joplin was beautiful and safe, and that Opal would have her own room with a garden view. Then she placed the power of attorney form on the table and told Opal to sign it for her own protection. Opal sat across from her daughter and looked at the form and looked at the brochure and looked at the folder of documents and did not touch any of them. The kitchen was quiet. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere outside, a cardinal was singing the same 2 notes over and over. Then Opal pushed the form back across the table. She did not push it hard. She did not push it with anger. She pushed it the way you push away a plate of food you did not order and do not intend to eat. How much did the developer offer you, Nadine? The silence that followed was the loudest sound Corinne had ever heard in that kitchen. Nadine's face changed. Not a dramatic collapse. Something subtler, a loosening around the eyes, the particular stillness of a person who has just heard one question they were certain would never be asked. Nadine did not deny it. She did not ask how Opal knew. She sat at her mother's kitchen table with the power of attorney form lying between them like a card that had been played and lost, and she said nothing. Opal stood up. She was a small woman, and the kitchen table came almost to her waist. But when she stood, she filled the room the way certain people fill rooms when they have decided to stop being patient. She walked to the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where she kept twist ties and rubber bands and the spare key to the front door. She pulled out an envelope. Inside it was a document Harlan Bryce had prepared the previous week, the one Opal had told Corinne she needed to think about. It was a formal written agreement granting Corinne Hadley the right of indefinite land use and residential occupancy on the rear ridge of the Rankin property. It was signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Opal had driven herself to the courthouse on a Thursday morning while Corinne was working at the feed store. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She laid the document on the table next to the power of attorney form and looked at her daughter. "You wanted to sell this land over my body," she said. Corinne fixed it with her hands. "I know which one of you earned a place here." Nadine stared at the document. She stared at her mother. And then something Corinne had not anticipated happened. Nadine did not argue. She did not threaten legal action. She did not mention the developer or the assisted living facility or the competency evaluation. She put her face in her hands and she cried. It came out in a way that was not performed and not controlled. Nadine cried the way people cry when the thing they have been holding together finally comes apart in a place where they cannot stop it. She told Opal she was in debt. She told her the house in Tulsa was mortgaged twice. She told her that her life looked fine from the outside, but it was collapsing from the inside. And she had thought selling the land would fix everything. And she knew it was wrong. And she could not stop herself because stopping would have meant admitting that she had failed at the life she had chosen when she left this hill 30 years ago. Opal did not hug her daughter. She did not say it was all right. She stood at the head of her own kitchen table and looked at the woman she had raised and said the truest thing Corinne had ever heard one person say to another. "You could have asked me for help. Instead, you tried to prove I was crazy." Nadine wiped her face with the back of her hand. She gathered the unsigned power of attorney and the brochure and the folder and put them back in her bag. She looked at her mother one more time. Then she walked out of the kitchen and drove down the gravel road. And the sound of her tires on the loose stone faded into the valley like the last note of a song that nobody wanted to hear. Opal sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. Corinne did not speak. She filled the kettle from the jug of spring water she had carried down from the ridge that morning and set it on the stove and waited for it to boil. Then she poured tea into one of Opal's blue ceramic cups and set it in front of the old woman and sat down across from her. They drank tea in silence. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. The confrontation did not end when Nadine's SUV disappeared. The following Monday, Harlan Bryce called Opal. Nadine's attorney had sent a short notice withdrawing the request for a competency evaluation. There would be no petition, no guardian ad litem, no hearing. The letter did not contain an apology. Lawyers rarely put apologies in documents unless somebody is paying them to. It simply stated that the client would not pursue the matter further. That afternoon, Ridgeway Land Development emailed Harlan as well. They were closing their file on the Rankin property because the owner had never authorized negotiations. Any preliminary sketches or valuation work had been based on representations made by a family member without legal authority. Opal listened to Harlan read both messages over the phone. When he finished, she said, "Good," then she hung up. Corinne was sitting at the kitchen table. "Is that all you are going to say? What do you want me to say?" "I do not know. I thought maybe you would feel relieved." Opal looked toward the window. Wallace's grave was out beyond the machine shed where the grass stayed short because she still walked there every few days. "I am relieved the land is safe. I am not relieved that my daughter had to fail before she told me the truth." Corinne understood that distinction better than most people could. A week later, Harlan sold 2 copies of the recorded ridge agreement to Opal. One stayed in the farmhouse safe with the will and tax receipts. The other Opal carried up the hill herself. Corinne was repairing the latch on the chicken coop when Opal handed it to her. Corinne read the first page and then the second. Indefinite residential and land use rights on the rear ridge. Access by the existing trail and road. The right to maintain the shed and the system serving it. No right to sell, subdivide, mortgage, or transfer any portion of the underlying land. The agreement ended only if Corinne voluntarily surrendered it, or if both women agreed in writing to change it. It was exactly what Corinne had asked for, without knowing how to ask for it. She folded the pages carefully. "This is more than I need." "No," Opal said. "It is exactly enough." Corinne looked down the ridge toward the farmhouse. "What happens when you are gone?" Opal's face tightened for a moment, not with fear but with impatience at the idea that death required a special tone of voice. "The agreement stays with the land." Harlan made sure of that. And Nadine will inherit whatever I leave her. But she will inherit it knowing you have a legal place on this ridge. Corinne felt the old instinct to refuse rise immediately. The instinct to avoid becoming a burden, a complication, a reason for somebody else to resent her. Opal saw it. Do not start. I was not going to say anything. You were going to offer to leave after I die so Nadine can sell without trouble. Corinne said nothing. Opal pointed a finger at her. That is exactly what you were going to do. Maybe. Then stop planning to make everybody else's life easier by making your own disappear. The sentence hit harder than Opal could have known. Corinne had done that for 22 years at the hospital, for 14 years in a marriage, for 6 years with a daughter who called only when the distance felt safe. She had made herself useful because usefulness was easier to ask people to accept than need. Opal tapped the folded agreement in Corinne's hand. You worked for this place, not the dirt. The place. There is a difference. Corinne looked at the shed behind her, at the white oak frame that had once stood under rusted siding, while 40 people walked past it and saw nothing worth saving. She put the papers inside. All right. Opal nodded. Then come down and fix my porch light. It flickers every time the wind blows. Corinne smiled. Yes, ma'am. The crisis had not made them family. The paperwork had not made them family. What made them family was that 5 minutes later, they were standing on a porch, arguing about whether the problem was the bulb or the socket. And neither one of them considered the possibility that Corinne might not be there tomorrow to finish the argument. The weeks after Nadine left were quiet. Not the quiet of waiting for something to happen, but the quiet of something having already happened, and the world slowly adjusting to the shape it had made. Corinne finished the interior of the shed. The walls were cedar boards from the sawmill's reject pile. $60 for a truckload of planks too knotty and too rough for the showroom. And when she nailed them up, the whole room filled with a smell of cedar, a smell that 4 years later has not faded and probably never will. The floor was the shed's original oak plank, saved from the disassembly, hand sanded on her knees over 3 evenings and oiled with linseed until it glowed the color of dark honey. Her bed sat under a quilt the women of Opal's church had sewn her that first Christmas, a pattern of interlocking stars in blue and white cotton that they presented to her after the Sunday service without ceremony or speeches. There was a table built from the leftover timber of the frame itself, legs cut from a beam too short to use structurally, a reading chair from a thrift store in West Plains, a yard sale propane camp stove for cooking, and a covered porch of reclaimed deck boards where Boone claimed his patch of afternoon sun every day at the same hour, with the precision of a man who has learned that the best things in life arrive on schedule. Every single purchase went into a dollar store spiral notebook, down to the last screw, down to the $9 can of enamel paint and the $24 roll of plastic sheeting and the $12 battery from the farm auction. The number at the bottom of the final page reads $838. That winter, a storm came through the Ozarks that stripped branches off trees and snapped power lines across 3 counties. The wind started in the late afternoon, and by dark it was tearing at the roof tin with a sound that made Corinne's chest tight. She stayed up through the night feeding the stove and checking the roof seams with a flashlight and covering the IBC tarps against the driving ice that hammered against the shed walls like gravel thrown by an angry hand. Boone lay under the table with his eyes open, watching her move back and forth across the room. He did not whine. He did not panic. He watched her the way he always did, with complete trust that if she was awake and moving, then everything was under control. At 3 in the morning, the wind shifted direction, and a gust hit the north wall hard enough to make the frame creak. Corinne put her hand against the wall and felt the timbers flex and hold. White oak does not break. It bends. It absorbs. It holds on. She had built this frame once by hand, and she knew every joint and every peg, and she trusted them the way she trusted her own bones because they were the same material in a different shape. In the morning, the shed stood untouched. Not a sheet of tin had lifted. Not a drop of water had come through. The solar panels had survived intact because Corinne had built the racks low to the ground and angled into the prevailing wind, which was something her father had taught her about building in exposed locations. You do not fight the wind. You let it slide over you. She walked down the ridge to check on Opal and found a walnut tree down across the south fence line, its crown resting 6 feet from the edge of the porch. The trunk had snapped 8 feet up where a branch scar had weakened the heartwood, and the weight of the crown had pulled 4 fence posts out of the ground and flattened 30 feet of wire. She cut that tree with a borrowed chainsaw and repaired the fence before noon. She stacked the walnut wood in a separate pile because walnut burns clean and slow and is worth keeping for the coldest nights. Opal stood on the porch, watching her work the way she had watched Corinne do everything since the first day, quietly and without offering help, because she understood that some people do their best work when they are left alone to do it. When Corinne came up the steps to return the saw, Opal said something she had never said before. Your father would have done the same thing. She said it quietly, and she did not explain how she knew about Corinne's father. But she had heard enough stories over enough evenings on the porch, and enough Sunday drives to church, and enough Tuesday afternoons in the garden to understand where the knowledge in Corinne's hands had come from and what it meant that it was still there. It meant that the man who had taught his daughter to read grain and check joints and build things that last had not wasted his time. His work lived in her hands the way Wallace Rankin's work lived in the fence lines and the machine shed and the garden beds that Corinne had brought back from ragweed. Spring came slowly the way it always comes to the Ozarks, fighting for every degree against nights that stayed cold well into April. Corinne put 12 chickens from Opal's flock into a coop she built from pallet wood and cattle wire, setting the posts deep to discourage the raccoons that came up from the creek bottom every night looking for an easy meal. She planted raised beds on the south side of the shed with compost from Opal's old pile, compost that had been building for 20 years and was black and rich and full of worms, and seed packets from the dollar store that cost 99 cents each. By June, both gardens were producing. By August, the raised beds fed both households, squash and tomatoes and green beans and peppers and herbs that Opal dried on screens in her kitchen the way she had dried them every summer since the Kennedy administration. The garden became the one place where the two women worked side by side without needing to decide who was in charge. Opal knew soil. She knew when to plant by the phase of the moon and when to harvest by the feel of the stem and when to pull a tomato green and let it ripen on the kitchen windowsill and when to leave it on the vine for one more day of sun. Corinne knew structure. She built the trellises and the raised bed frames and the cucumber cages out of cattle wire and cedar poles. Between them, they grew more food than either of them could eat, and the surplus went to the church food pantry in West Plains, where Pastor Fossey accepted it with the quiet gratitude of a man who knew exactly where it came from and how much it meant. Every Sunday, Corinne drove Opal to church and then to the Pizza Hut buffet on the highway because Opal insisted. Opal paid. Neither point was open for discussion. They sat across from each other in a vinyl booth, and Opal ate exactly 2 slices of pepperoni pizza and 1 breadstick and 1 small salad, and Corinne ate whatever she wanted because Opal told her she was too thin, and a woman who splits that much firewood needs more than 1 slice. Nadine called one evening in late summer. Corinne was on the porch when Opal answered the phone inside. She could hear Opal's voice through the screen door. The conversation was short. Nadine did not mention the land or the lawyer or the developer. She asked if her mother was feeling all right. Opal said she was. Nadine asked about the garden. Opal said the tomatoes were early this year. There was a pause that lasted long enough for Corinne to hear the crickets start up in the field below the house. Then Nadine said goodbye, and Opal said goodbye, and that was all. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was a telephone line between a mother and a daughter that had not been cut, and in a family that had come as close to cutting it as this one had, an open line was enough for now. Thanksgiving came cold and clear. Opal set 3 plates on the table instead of 2, and Corinne did not ask who the 3rd plate was for, because she had learned to let Opal reveal things in her own time. The answer came at 11 in the morning when a car pulled up the gravel road that was not Nadine's silver SUV. Jessamine Hadley drove a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door and a crack across the lower left corner of the windshield, and a back seat full of the kind of clutter that accumulates in the car of a 24-year-old woman who has not figured out yet where she is going. Fast food bags and textbooks, and a gym bag and a cardboard box of what looked like clothes that had not been unpacked. She parked next to the minivan and got out and stood in Opal's yard and looked at her mother and did not say anything for a long time. The last time they had seen each other was 2 years before the injury, at a restaurant in Tulsa, where Jess had suggested they meet because meeting at the restaurant was easier than inviting Corinne to her apartment. And Corinne had adopted the geometry of that suggestion, even if Jess had not intended her to. They had eaten lunch, they had talked about Jess's classes and Jess's job at a retail store and the weather in Tulsa versus the weather in West Plains. They had not talked about why Jess had chosen to go with her father, or why she had stopped calling, or why the word mom had disappeared from her vocabulary and been replaced by a first name she never used because she did not call at all. Corinne walked down from the porch. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked the way she walked everywhere, steady and unhurried, because she had spent 6 years learning not to show Jess too much need. Showing need had cost her once and the lesson had held. They stood 5 feet apart in the gravel driveway, with Boone sitting between them looking back and forth the way he did, when two people were standing close enough to pet him and neither one was doing it. Jess looked older than 24. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been carrying something they have not told anyone about, something heavier than a gym bag and harder to put down than a box of unpacked clothes. She said she wanted to see where her mother was living. She said it simply. She did not apologize. She did not explain how she had found the address, or who had told her about the shed, or why she had chosen this particular Thursday before Thanksgiving to drive 5 hours from Tulsa. She said she wanted to see, and Corinne heard inside that sentence the one thing Jess could not yet say, which was that she wanted to know if her mother was all right. Corinne took her up the ridge trail. Jess did not speak on the walk up. Boone walked ahead of them on the path, the way he always did, checking the trail for anything that did not belong. When they reached the shed, Corinne opened the door and stood aside. Jess stood in the doorway for a full minute. She looked at the cedar walls. She looked at the oak floor. She looked at the wood stove with the repaired leg and the new chimney pipe going up through the ceiling. She looked at the quilt on the bed and the table made from leftover framing timber and the reading chair and the covered porch beyond the back door. And then she looked at the cast-iron clawfoot bathtub sitting under the window with the valley and the hills visible through the glass, and her face changed. She told Corinne she had spent 6 years picturing her mother living in something she could not bring herself to describe out loud, a word that lived somewhere between shack and ruin. She had imagined tarps and extension cords, and the kind of squalor that confirms every fear a child has when a parent's life falls apart and the child does not reach out to catch them. She had imagined it because imagining it was easier than calling, and calling would have meant admitting that she had chosen not to help when help was the only thing her mother had asked for. She stayed 3 days. She slept on a cot Corinne borrowed from Opal's spare room. She ate Thanksgiving dinner at Opal's table and listened to Opal tell stories about Wallace and the early years on the farm, and the time a bull got loose in the garden and ate every tomato plant down to the stem. She helped Corinne carry water from the spring and split kindling for the stove and feed the chickens in the morning. And she did all of it with the careful attention of someone who is trying to learn the shape of a life she had refused to look at for 6 years. The second night, they sat on the porch. Boone lay between them with his muzzle on Corinne's boot. The valley was dark below them except for a single light at Wade Kettner's place, and the stars were thick overhead in the way they can only be thick when there are no streetlights for 15 miles in any direction. Jess asked why her mother never called back after that phone call, the one where Jess had told her to contact a shelter. Corinne was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Because you told me to go to a shelter, and I could not make you want to help me." The silence after that sense lasted a long time. Long enough for the temperature to drop a degree. Long enough for Boone to shift his weight and sigh in his sleep, the way old dogs sigh when they have decided the people around them are safe. Jess said, "I was wrong. I was so wrong." There was no dramatic embrace. There was no speech. There were women sitting on a porch in the dark, in the Ozark hills with a 13-year-old dog between them. And one of them had just said the hardest true thing she had ever said, and the other one had heard it, and that was enough. Jess drove back to Tulsa on a Sunday. She called that night. She called the next Sunday night. She has called every Sunday night since. The conversations are not long. They do not solve the 6 years of silence or undo the damage of a daughter choosing absence over effort. But they are consistent, and consistency is the thing Corinne values more than any other quality in the world. Because consistency is what she built her entire shed out of. Showing up, doing the work. Coming back tomorrow. One morning in December, Corinne asked Opal how long she could stay on the ridge. It was not a question born of anxiety. It was not the question of a woman who feared being told to leave. It was a practical question from a practical woman who wanted to know the terms of her life so she could plan accordingly. She asked it the same way she would ask about the weather or the price of feed. Direct, undecorated. The way people speak when they have been through enough that they no longer see the point of approaching a question sideways. Opal was sitting in her kitchen chair with a cup of tea and the morning light coming through the window above the sink. She did not answer with words. She set the cup down and pushed her chair back and walked to the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where she kept twist ties and rubber bands and the spare key to the front door. The same drawer she had opened the day she pulled out the land use agreement that stopped Nadine in her tracks. She pulled out a key, the spare key to the farmhouse. A brass key on a plain metal ring with no tag and no label. She held it out to Corinne and looked at her the way she had looked at her on the very first day when she stood on the porch and pointed at the broken gate hinge. But the look was different now. It was not the look of a woman evaluating a stranger. It was the look of a woman who had made a decision about someone a long time ago and was only now getting around to making it official. It was not a key for a tenant. It was not a key for an employee or a caretaker or a charity case. It was a key for family. And Corinne took it and put it in her pocket and did not say thank you, because thank you would have reduced it to a transaction. And what had just happened between them was not a transaction. It was an acknowledgement. It was the final answer to every question that Nadine's letters and Lorraine's clipboard and Wade's suspicion and the county's regulations had ever raised about whether Corinne Hadley belonged on that ridge. She belonged. The woman who owned the land said so. The key in her pocket proved it. Corinne has a savings envelope in the drawer of the table she built from leftover framing timber. It is a plain white envelope from the credit union, and on the front of it, she has written 2 words in pencil. Well pump. Next year, she wants pressurized water at a real kitchen sink. A hand pump driven by a pipe down to the water table. Something that does not depend on electricity or rain or anything except the aquifer that has been feeding that spring for longer than anyone in Howell County has been alive. She adds to that envelope every week from her paycheck at the feed store. The number grows slowly, the way everything in her life grows, by small, steady additions that accumulate into something nobody expected. Boone is 13 years old, gray around the muzzle, slower on the trail than he used to be. His insulin stays cold in the 12-volt cooler, and his blood sugar stays level, and he still claims his patch of afternoon sun on the porch every day at the same hour. He still walks the ridge trail ahead of Corinne every morning, checking for anything that does not belong. He still puts his chin on her boot when she sits on the porch in the evening, and he still sleeps on the floor next to her bed inside white oak walls that she took apart with her own hands and carried up a hill and raised again one timber at a time with a come-along winch and a chain wrapped around a walnut tree. $838. A condemned shed, a handshake, a broken gate hinge, a spiral notebook full of numbers that nobody believed could add up to a life, and a woman who fell asleep every night in a home she built from the things other people threw away. in a place she earned by fixing what other people refused to touch, surrounded by the smell of cedar and the sound of cold water, running through a stone spring box on a ridge in the Ozark hills where nobody was watching and nobody needed to be.